Or sit where you can see. Why don't you sit out there where you can see? Can you see? Okay. Jim, do you want to start? George, I think we're all set. What's that? George, when you're ready, let me know. Okay. Okay, everybody, if you could just take your seats, that'd be great. Everybody should have a copy of a 3-page sheet. It has Monroe Community Cemetery, and then it has names from Seamanville and the Webb Cemetery, and I'm going to explain more about that. But first, let me thank you and wish you good afternoon and welcome, friends and guests. Before I begin, I just want to say thank you to those who helped in my research. I want to thank Brother Bruce Crandall from the Sons of Union Veterans, 124th, New York. Ellis Camp, Bruce is the secretary and a former teacher like myself from the Sons of Union Veterans. My good friend and confidant, Jim Nelson, who's just been wonderful, and our tech supervisor, George Carney, here today to put things together. So I don't know how long this is going to run. We're going to see. I've got some slides for you, some pictures. Everybody needs pictures to kind of put things in the framework. So I'm Paul Ellis Graham. I'm a retired social studies teacher from Monroe Woodbury High School, and I'm a past department commander of the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War and currently serve as president of the Lincoln Group of New York, and I'm on the board for the Lincoln Forum in Gettysburg. So it's a lot of fun to do this, something we've been talking about a long time. When I came to Monroe in the fall of 1988, I decided to join the Historical Society so I had a better sense of the history of the place that I lived in. And we lived in Monroe, and then we moved to Highland Mills, and now we live in Marlborough with our dog Ellie and my wife Mary, who's over here, and was hired by Dr. Greta Cohn, who's in the front row. Yay, thank you, Greta. All right, anyway, so let me start. Thank you. When the Civil War began, New York responded with zeal as the governor and the state legislature called for the mustering of New York volunteers in service to the Union cause. Due to its rapid growth and wealth, New York contributed men and materiel to the war effort. Despite deep political divisions within the state, New York sent more men to the Union Army than any other state. It had a total of 298 regiments combined that contained a total of 448,000 men. Hard to believe. Monroe was only one of many small communities throughout the North that answered the call to serve their state and nation during its greatest crisis. Its residents, those who were born here, lived here, retired here, and died here, or paid the ultimate sacrifice during the war, left all of us with a varied and valued legacy of public service in duty to their country. This talk will attempt to pay tribute to them. Monroe was engaged as many communities were during this time period. According to Daniel Niles Freeland, who was the minister of the First Presbyterian Church of Monroe at the time, critical national issues were on everybody's mind. According to Freeland, a debating society was held in the basement of the church and was quite popular with such topics as the Missouri Compromise, the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, and the extension of slavery into the territories were considered. When the war came, the society disbanded. According to Freeland, during the war, a country singing school was started because not all the churches had musical instruments, and singing was needed to teach the young ones how to read music. Union favorites such as the Star-Spangled Banner, Rally Round the Flag, and Tenting Tonight on the Old Campground were heard frequently, offering inspiration to those families whose sons were serving on the battlefield. Residents not in service, such as many women and children, helped the cause by packaging fruit, collecting linen and flannel, reading glasses and supplies for soldiers in the field, and then beginning in 1863, supplemented that with information and with supplies for newly freed slaves. In 1861, Monroe was a small farming and mining community during this period. According to the federal census in 1860, its population total was 3,975 out of a New York State population of 1,068,000, which makes it 0.3% of the whole state. So we have a very small area and small percentage of people here at the time. The regiments in which Monroe's residents served, however, were 14 from New York State, 2 from Pennsylvania, 2 from New Jersey, and 1 from the U.S. at large. The names of those residents are as followed, along with the names of those that served in them. So what I'm going to try to do here for you is I'm going to pull up a picture of, most often it's going to be a tombstone. I'll say a little bit about the men who served in it briefly and talk about what that regiment did, work my way through that. Most of the information you're going to hear today is based on the 124th New York, the Orange Blossoms, because most of the Monroe residents who fought in the Civil War served in that regiment. So let me just pull this picture up for you. The first one is the Brooks Tombstone. This Here we go. There were 2 members from Monroe in the first New York State Engineers. They were brothers, John Howard Brooks and Thomas Benton Brooks. Recruited from the state at large for 3 years, because enlistments varied. Some enlistments were 9 months, some were 1 year, some were 2 years, some were 3. They were mustered in at New York City, assigned to the Department of the South at Port Royal, South Carolina. They were involved in the siege at Fort Wagner, which I'm going to mention later, Fort Pulaski, Fort Sumter, and Petersburg in 1864 for the final assault. The regiment suffered its worst losses on Morris Island outside of Charleston. The next group will be Thomas Cassia, and he was, let me find his stone here. Let's see, I have to, when I download. Okay, Thomas Cassia was in the 2nd New York State Cavalry. He is also buried in the Monroe Community Cemetery. This cavalry regiment was organized in Scarsdale and Westchester in the summer of 1861. It was meant 3-year enlistments. There were 8 cavalry regiments that lost most men, unfortunately, and were reorganized in New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, under General McDowell's command at the First Battle of Bull Run. They became part of the Army of the Potomac, served at Beverly's Ford, Richmond, and Danville, and Appomattox, and they're all part of the final campaign that ended the war. The next one on the list is Joseph Pratt, who's buried in the Webb Cemetery, and I didn't know the Webb Cemetery existed. How many of you out there knew the Webb Cemetery existed? I didn't know. It's one of the 3 cemeteries in Monroe. Jim showed it to me. It's off East Monbassia Road. It's on private property, and today it's strewn with fallen branches and things like that. Anyway, Joseph Pratt is in there, and he's got a great, interesting story, which I'll talk about. So let me just find him and pull him up here for you. Okay, Joseph Pratt. He served in the 4th New York State Volunteers. If you ever see NYSV, that's New York State Volunteers, they were recruited out of Brooklyn, 2-year enlistment periods, stationed at Fort McHenry in Baltimore, joined the Army of the Potomac in June of 1862, fought at Antietam, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville. Pratt was also a first lieutenant in the 84th U.S. Colored Troops in 1862. under the law, colored troops could not have white could only have white officers. So Joseph Pratt distinguished himself in that respect. Okay, next on the list, on number 4, the 7th Artillery, we actually have 2 people. We have James Morgan. Don't remember, no problem. Okay. Yes.
Are you reviewing all of the people from the area that fought in the war, or only the people that are buried in the
There are some, I'm talking about most of the people that died and served in the war. There are people, because remember, Monroe was, among other areas throughout the country, regiments were raised. I'm going to kind of get into this a little bit. Every area in New York State was required before the draft to submit a list of state volunteers that were able-bodied. So some came to Monroe from other places. Some people from Monroe went to other places to enlist. So it's really in figuring out who lived here, died here, and buried here becomes very, very difficult. So I'm trying to give you as an overview as best I can. Okay, no problem. Organized as a combined artillery infantry regiment in Albany in 1863-64, it was all artillery. Its primary duty was defense of Washington, D.C. It was ordered to the front at the Battle of Spotsylvania, and before the war's end, it was assigned garrison duty at Fort McHenry in Baltimore. And we also have, by the way, here as well, buried in the Seamanville Cemetery, which is the First Presbyterian Church's cemetery located on Spring Street, Mr. D.E.W.C. Williams. And try to find out how the letters to his name make sense to me. They don't, so I'll just show you what his stone looks like. How many people were there and what were they doing? Okay, so this is Williams here. Okay. Oops, that didn't click. Come on, why didn't you click? I hate it when things don't work. Yes. Yeah, I can to some degree. Sometimes I wrote that down. I didn't always report that. Like, for example, I know that there was a James Barnes that registered to serve in the 124th. He was killed at Chancellorsville, but he's not buried here. So, yeah, there are some. I'll give you the overall totals. I don't always have individual names unless it applies to the story that's going forward. So we'll see. Okay, next on the list, 40th New York. I'm doing these, by the way, in order of in order of the number of regiments. I had to try to come up with some sort of order. So this is. He was, by the way, a career soldier. He was in the 38th New York State Volunteers. He was a veteran of the Mexican War, something that I'll talk about later. He participated in the First Bull Run, the Battle of the 7 Days, which was part of McClellan's Peninsular Campaign, Chancellorsville, and then was mustered out of the Army in 1864. There's an interesting story, some controversy involving General Ward, but I think I can solve that problem. Okay, all right, let's go to Joseph Jefferson. Next on the list. I had a Jefferson in school. I wonder if he's related. Joseph Jefferson, Served in the 40th New York State Volunteers. He is buried in the Monroe Community Cemetery. This was called the Mozart Regiment. I'm not really sure why. It sounded like music to my ears the first time I heard it. He was recruited in New York City. It was recruited in New York City as part of the Army of the Potomac, fought in the Battle of the 7 Days, Chancellorsville, Fredericksburg, Gettysburg, the Wilderness, and Petersburg, major campaigns of the Civil War of the Army of the Potomac. Okay? Next, and this is an interesting story. A couple of interesting pieces here are people who had ethnic connections to the regiments they served in. This is Charles Beckenstein, 54th New York Volunteers. Anybody want to guess what kind of... Yes, that's correct. This was part of Barney's Black Rifles, organization of German soldiers, organized in New York City, in Brooklyn, a 3-year term of service. They fought at Chancellorsville, Gettysburg, Charleston, and were also involved at the siege of Fort Wagner, which is Charleston Harbor. Okay? Next on the list is Silas Galloway from the 56th New York State Volunteers, and he's on here too. Pull him up. Silas Galloway. I took these on a nice day in Monroe, not today, thank goodness. Anyway, they were organized in Newburgh. They served in a 3-year term. They were located in Washington, D.C., around Yorktown, Virginia, Malvern Hill. In 1863, they were transferred to Beaufort, South Carolina. It's Beaufort, North Carolina, Beaufort, North Carolina, in case anybody asks, and mustered out at Charleston after the war ended. The next gentleman, Hiram Kelly. So if I say the name Kelly, what kind of brigade is he going to go into? He's going to go into an Irish brigade. So let's pull up. It was the 3rd Irish Regiment mustered in New York City, 63rd New York State Volunteers for 3 years. It was engaged in defending D.C. at the Battle of Yorktown, Battle of 7 Days, Antietam, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, Gettysburg with severe losses at Cold Harbor, something that I'll talk about later too. They were mustered out of the Army on June 30th, 1865 in Alexandria. Cold Harbor was an attempt to siege around Richmond at Petersburg, where Grant tried to dig in tunnels and blow up the Confederate earthworks and resulted in a huge mess. Anyway, okay, next we have 2 people. This is the 66th New York Volunteer. We have Bethel Dorgas, who's buried in the community cemetery. He's located right near the Memorial to Veterans. This was part of the Governor's Guard out of New York City, assigned to the Army of the Potomac, served at the Battle of 7 Days, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, Gettysburg, the Wilderness, Cold Harbor, and Petersburg. The 124th is involved in a lot of those major engagements as well. And then there's someone else from Monroe. He actually is buried now in the Seamanville Cemetery. His name is Dr. John Forshee, and he has an interesting story because he's a very young... Okay, so here we see it. I'll say more about him later on. John Forshee contracted dysentery, which was not unusual, by the way. Just chronic diarrhea from lack of food, disease when they didn't have the antibiotics that we now used, and unfortunately He came home to Monroe in 1862 and passed away. But I want to just show you before I move on. Let me just show you the emblem that's next to it. This is for Okay, next is a gentleman by the name of Niall Smith, who served in the 93rd New York State Volunteers. He was also in the 124th, which makes it interesting, because these men, if their enlistments ended early, they sometimes... Oh, sorry, that better? No problem. Thank you, George. Okay. Great. All right. So the 93rd New York, also called the Morgan Rifles, were organized in Washington County, which was outside of Albany, part of McClellan's Peninsular Campaign, fought with him at the Battle of the 7 Days at Antietam, and then later Fredericksburg as guards for at headquarters. Half of their men were lost in the wilderness and served also at Petersburg in Virginia. Okay? All right. The next person is another Kelly. It's Nelson Kelly. I believe they may be from the same family because they're buried next to each other. Cemeteries is important. We're fortunate in Monroe that a lot of the stones are up, but if you go to other cemeteries, that's not always the case. There's another veteran whose stone I'll pull up is literally broken into pieces. It's really helpful if people and organizations can get together and go clean headstones and do the things that these people deserve. Anyway, Nelson Kelly was part of the 97th New York State Volunteer Regiment. They were nicknamed the Conkling Rifles. They were organized in Oneida and Herkimer counties and were at Bull Run, First Battle of Bull Run, Antietam, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, and at Gettysburg they captured 382 prisoners from North Carolina. They suffered their heaviest losses in the wilderness, participated in Cold Harbor, Appomattox, and were mustered out in July of 1865. Okay, I want to mention the 111th New York State Volunteers, and I don't have a stone for him because he's not buried in Monroe, but his name is Benjamin Thompson. He was originally out of Auburn, New York, saw service at Gettysburg, the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Appomattox. There were only 4 other New York regiments that lost more men during the Civil War than the 111th. And I have a great story about Benjamin Thompson that I'll share with you later. Okay, so at this point, what I do, and try to hit the highlights here because we're going to now talk about the 124th, the Orange Blossoms. How many of you have heard of them? How have you seen the monument to the Orange Blossoms right in the center of Goshen, by the way, which was restored fairly recently, although it looks like it still needs work. Because many Civil War veterans from Monroe served in the 124th, a more detailed description of its exploits is required. The 124th served with the Army of the Potomac and was a critical part of its history from 1862 to 65. The original history of the regiment was written by its last commanding officer, General Charles Wygant. This is an anniversary copy of his history. There's another book out there by Chuck LaRocca, who was a social studies teacher in Pine Bush, who did this book, the 124th New York. Chuck is a member of the reenactors group of the 124th, and Chuck has done a wonderful job trying to piece together. I didn't have time to go through both. I took the first one. Anyway, just want to say a few things about it. He notes that, this is LaRocca now in the introduction to Wygant's first edition, notes that it was in fact the 124th that served as the inspiration for Stephen Crane's Red Badge of Courage. How many of you knew that? Okay. By the way, Stephen Crane's brother William lived in Port Jervis at the time and definitely would have known about Wygant's history. According to one of my good friends, Peter Osborne, who was the president of the, what was the Historical Society in Port Jervis, the Battle of Minisink. Anyway, in Port Jervis, Peter told us that there was a researcher came and stayed in Port Jervis in his home to do research on Stephen Crane's novel and the stories of Port Jervis, which were told by the veterans who gathered there. Anyway, before a moment of clarification about the reorganization, about the organization of men that might be necessary to help you, and it actually helped me, to get an understanding about the structure of the Army so that you have a sense of what we're talking about here. So, for example, a regiment included approximately 800 men, one regiment, and that was broken up into companies. And we'll talk about companies because all these people that we're going to talk about were organized into companies as well. The company that served in the 124th was Company C with its volunteers from Monroe. Then, following a regiment, there is a brigade of 2,600 men. They're part of a division, which is 8,000 men. They're part of a larger corps, which is 26,000 men. And then the Army of the Potomac they were attached to, 80,000 men. So there's all these different divisions, and it's difficult to keep up as the numbers decline. How they reorganize their corps, their divisions, and their regiments does become rather time-consuming. When the war ended, the 124th had served. Just give me a sec. The 124th had served the state and nation at the following major battles: Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, Gettysburg, the Wilderness, Cold Harbor, Spotsylvania Courthouse, and Petersburg. Yes?
You didn't mention battalion, where they fit.
Were the what?
Battalion.
Oh, battalions. No. I don't have that at the time. This is what I was given when I looked it up. This is what I came up with. So I don't know where battalion fits in here. Anybody want to clarify that for me? Barry, have you got an idea? Not sure. I'm wondering, and the only reason I'm just wondering this, if that wasn't something that was done later and not during the Civil War, may have occurred later on. Anyway, in July of 1862, President Lincoln sent a letter to the nation's governors, the northern governors, requesting 300,000 three-year men. New York divided the state into military districts, and the volunteers from this area were part of a district from Orange and Sullivan County when it was created. Once a sufficient number of volunteers were enlisted, Colonel Augustus Van Horn Ellis of New Windsor was selected as the regiment's commander. He was already in the Army, having served at Bull Run with the 71st New York State Militia. Upon assuming command, he noted that what he expected from his men: the soldier's business is to do as much damage to the enemy as possible. So let me show you Colonel Augustus Van Horn Ellis. Originally, he was from New York City. The regiment was initially given the name the American Guard. It was given to them by Colonel Ellis before its regiment number was assigned by the state. It contained 10 companies of men across Orange County, and Company C, of which Monroe's volunteers served in mostly, was called the Cornwall Company. The regiment trained at Camp Wickham in Goshen, which is just beyond the grounds of the courthouse, I think further up the hill toward where the middle school is today. They then left for New York City before making it to Washington just outside the capital. Its initial assignment was to protect the city in the midst of the crisis. The first direct engagement of the 124th occurred at Fredericksburg in Virginia, 50 miles south of Washington. By that time, General Ambrose E. Burnside had replaced George McClellan as commanding general for the Army of the Potomac. Burnside's plan was to cross the Rappahannock River and advance toward Richmond before Lee could organize a sufficient force to resist. Dependent on constructed pontoon boats or bridges to cross the river caused a crucial delay. When the bridges were finally in place, the Union Army crossed the river near Fredericksburg, sustaining heavy losses because the Confederates had time to build up their defenses and put these men under a lot of stress. The 124th was under direct enemy assault and fire, and Burnside was forced to retreat back over the river. While the Union losses at Fredericksburg were heavy due to the solid Confederate gun emplacements, the 124th suffered fewer losses when compared to the rest of the Army involved in that battle at the time. Now, in January of 1863, General Hooker replaced Burnside as commander of the Army of the Potomac. At the same time, the regiment received its first payday after 5 months. Talk about pay. How'd you like to get paid 5 months after you're in the Army? In April, President Lincoln arrived to review the troops in camp. The 124th received special praise from its Brigadier General Emil Whipple. Unfortunately, General Whipple is going to be killed. Hooker planned to lure Lee to the Army and the Army of Northern Virginia into an attack on their ground. General Daniel Sickles' corps, who was the corps commander that involved the 124th, was mostly west of Fredericksburg, hoping to engage the rear of Lee's army until all of a sudden Hooker ordered his men to fall back toward the Chancellor House, despite pleas from his officers. The officers thought they had a chance to go after Lee, and Hooker held them back. As Lee staged a light diversion in the center of Hooker's line, General Stonewall Jackson organized a flanking maneuver, which is a sweep on one side. The 124th was located on the right side of Union lines along the woods that created much confusion as skirmishers from both sides attempted to locate the enemy, sometimes at night. This confusion led to the unfortunate, or fortunate, depending on your point of view, death of Stonewall Jackson, who was unfortunately shot by his own men. Fearing more losses, Hooker ordered Sickles' men to fall back closer to his headquarters and reestablish their positions. The 124th, among the last to do so, were given orders to stay in position until they are withdrawn. Rebel advances by infantry and artillery left 100 men of the 124th to face 10,000 Confederate soldiers. The brave men retreated further back to the Sickles line. Ellis ordered his men, "Forward, my tulips." The 124th stopped the advance of the 23rd North Carolina and refused to break ranks until the rebels fell back out of range. Company C began with 34 men, and after the battle was over, 18 remained. Before the Battle of Chancellorsville, Ellis's men recaptured a Union battery before falling back. General Whipple and James Barnes, who was originally part of the 124th Company C, were killed in that battle. Ellis praised the efforts of his men, who he said fight like tigers. The 3 color bearers were shot, but the flag given to them by the women of Orange never touched the ground. Due to the losses suffered at Chancellorsville, Ellis now commanded the combined companies of the 86th and the 124th New York. The regiment saw action at Beverly's Ford along the Rappahannock and turned away a Confederate advance. Lee was now determined to make up for Confederate losses in the West by moving into Northern Territory. At the time, the Army of the Potomac and the Army of Northern Virginia had both about 80,000 men. Meanwhile, the 124th was among 9 regiments who were ordered to assist Union cavalry near Culpeper, Virginia. The opposing forces collided at Brandy Station, resulting in the severest and most extensive cavalry fight of the war. While 800 losses on both sides were noted, the 124th was recognized for its reliability and attention to duty. Following the Battle of Brandy Station, control of both the 86th and the 124th were given to General John Henry Hobart Ward, which was now under the command of General David Birney's division. Ward had been a career soldier, serving with distinction in the Mexican War, had served in McClellan's Peninsular Campaign. Major General Samuel Heitzman of the 3rd Corps was deeply appreciative of his role there when he temporarily served as brigade commander. In October of 1862, Ward was officially appointed Brigadier General of the 3rd Corps, which was now on its way back to Washington. Upon its return, it moved out through Maryland on its way to Gettysburg. At Emmitsburg, Maryland, roll call of the 124th revealed a count of 264 men for duty. Losses in the regiment were due to death, disease, and exhaustion. General George Meade replaced Hooker as commander of the Army of the Potomac, And on July 1st, 1863, the Army arrived in the field at Gettysburg, sensing the importance of the fight to come. The destiny of the Union was at stake. At Gettysburg, the 124th was positioned with Ward's brigade just south of the Little Round Top at a place called Devil's Den. General Lee, looking for weak points in the Union line, ordered General Longstreet to attack Birney's division on July 2nd, 1863. As Confederates poured into the line, Major Cromwell, part of the 124th, appealed to Ellis to lead a charge against the enemy. Ellis refused his request several times as he did not want to leave the higher ground. After the second request, Cromwell told Ellis, "The men must see us today." Ellis Ellis made sure that the advance was moving before leading the men forward. Cromwell was shot and killed. By now, the Third Confederate line continued its assault. In other words, the Confederates tried it once, and then twice, and now a third line to break through. Robert P. Cummins attempted to move the men back in order to protect the Union artillery, which was located behind them. Ellis took charge of his men on the Third Confederate attempt wavered. Unfortunately, Colonel Ellis was mortally wounded when he urged his men to save their major, who went down before Ellis himself was killed. The fighting continued without another attempt to take the hill. Corps Commander Sickles was severely wounded. General Ward praised the efforts of the 124th. Such a heroic, noble resistance as we had made was beyond anything he dared to hope for. The 124th was outnumbered 4-1 and held the enemy in check for an hour, resisting three fierce advances. So what I'd like to do at this point is pull up another picture. I was going to save this for later, but I think it's important to show. This is the 50th anniversary of the 124th Regiment at Gettysburg. This is the statue of Colonel Augustus Van Horn Ellis, describing the noble role of the orange blossoms. I'm going to Gettysburg as part of the Lincoln Forum this week. I will visit this site again, as I always do, and these are the men that served in that regiment. So this is from 1913.
Sorry, where did you say that?
This is Gettysburg, Devil's Den, just below Little Round Top. Okay. The 124th was not asked to engage the enemy again while at Gettysburg. On July 3rd, having failed to get around the Union flank, General George Pickett led his ill-fated charge against the Union center, and Lee was forced to retreat. At Devil's Den today, the monument stands as a memorial to Ellis and the orange blossoms on the spot where he fell. The bodies of Ellis and Cromwell were removed by his men and shipped back to Orange County for burial. After Gettysburg, 150 men of the 124th marched out with the brigade in pursuit of Lee's army. Lee had crossed the Potomac and settled down in Culpeper, Virginia, the 124th camped near Sulphur Springs for 6 weeks. Lee now turned his attempt to Washington, while the 3rd Corps moved northeast to Centerville, Virginia, just west of D.C. Meade chose not to follow, but instead decided to rebuild the Union supply lines. It's going to get him relieved of command. Lee had destroyed those supply lines earlier before the Battle of Gettysburg. After it, the 124th took part in minor skirmishes with the Army of Virginia rather than engage in one big battle. The 124th was still part of 3rd Corps, Ward's brigade, and those minor skirmishes were Kelly's Ford, Locust Grove, Mine Run in Virginia. Until their next engagement, both armies were separated by the Rapidan River. The women of Orange sent down a new battle flag for the regiment, and recruiters were sent back home to raise more men to serve. When an order came down shifting the regiment to a different brigade, General Ward and his officers appealed the decision primarily because due to the strong relationship they had with both their men and the 86th. Ward had commented, "There is no better fighting regiment in this division than the 124th New York." 2 days later, that order was rescinded. When the 124th pulled out of camp in May of 1864, its new major general in charge of all Union troops was General Ulysses S. Grant. In May of 64, Grant chose to advance through the wilderness, an area mixed with small farms, low-lying tree stumps, forests, and shrubs. Grant hoped he could get his men and make it through before Lee could discover his position. Lee chose to attack Grant's Army of the Potomac in the wilderness and catch him by surprise. When Lee's men attacked, the 124th was in the location known as Hoophole Forest, a low-lying area thick with 15 to 18-foot saplings that had to be pushed apart to move through. Just imagine what that is like. Very thin saplings and having to move to go through. They pushed the rebels back, taking 20 prisoners. 23 men were among the 124th casualties. Several had been killed. On the first day of the battle, the Army of Potomac had a total of 12,000 casualties, and its new commander had no desire to retreat. Neither did his chief adversary. Because of the topography, the Battle of the Wilderness could only be fought with infantry. When Lee ordered an attack on Grant's right flank, Grant put his whole Union line into action, 6 miles long. The 124th was part of General Winfield Scott Hancock's advance line and pushed the Confederates back. And it lost a dozen men along with Colonel Cummins during the Wilderness Campaign. Lee's attack came with Longstreet in charge of his men, who were 6 lines deep. The Union soldiers in disarray went back to the Union rear. The 124th had been overwhelmed. When the Union soldiers arrived back at their defenses, General Grant remarked, "I propose to fight it out here if it takes all summer." Remember, Grant was like a bulldog. Once he held on, he was not going to let go. The final Confederate assault came at 3 o'clock on May 6, 1864. General Longstreet was seriously wounded, and the 124th halted a Confederate advance that resulted in many of them dead and little new territory gained. After the Wilderness, Lee organized his men along the heights near the Spotsylvania Courthouse. The 124th New York and the 20th Indiana were sent out as skirmishers. That means to first engage the enemy, see where they are, but were forced to fall back due to the Confederate artillery. The next day, as part of Ward's brigade, Hancock's Corps, the 124th New York took the initiative and overran the Confederate earthworks, capturing over 3,000 rebels and Confederate Division Commander Edward Johnston. Lee attempted 5 times to retake these earthworks over a 20-hour span, but Hancock's men with the 124th held their ground. The 124th was especially effective here at Spotsylvania. Ward had given Wygant his direction. Take your regiment over the works or die in the attempt. The 124th moved through the woods, crawled up the hill toward the earthworks, and engaged in hand-to-hand combat. 2 of the enemy's guns were seized and turned on them. On May 15, 1864, strangely, General Ward was relieved of command, according to Wygant, unknown to those under him, so people didn't know what happened to Ward. According to Charles LaRocca, it was believed that General Ward was intoxicated while seeking to lead a charge. General Birney reported his behavior to General Hancock. Birney ordered Ward under arrest, as he was then relieved of command by Thomas Egan of the 40th New York. Norman Sly, for those who know Ted Sly, who was the former Orange County historian, that's his descendant, a private in the 124th, said he saw Ward every day during the campaign, never saw him drink, and never saw him drunk. So what the heck happened to Ward? He had received a head wound during the battle that may have accounted for his condition. General Ward's exit from the Army from the Civil War, he was honestly discharged in 1864, which leads me to believe they found out what happened and decided that he did not act inappropriate, ending his military career. When the war was over, he became a clerk in the Superior Court of New York City until 1896. During the summers, he often came to Monroe and visited the home of the Brooks family on North Main Street. At the age of 80, he was struck and killed by an Erie Railroad train in the center of the village of Monroe on July 24th, 1913. So I want to show you the Brooks family home. See if you've seen it. You'll know it because if you see it on North Main Street. This is it. This is called the Marble House. And I remember when I first came to Monroe, there were 2 floors to it, Jim, and when was the 3rd floor added? In the 20s? In the 30s, they added a 3rd floor, so that's the house. That's right on North Main Street. You may recognize it. After Spotsylvania Courthouse, the 124th was combined with the 86th New York and put under the command of Michael Stafford of the 86th. Hoping to weaken Lee's defenses northeast of Richmond, General Grant launched the last battle of his overland campaign, the Battle of Cold Harbor. It was a Union disaster as attempts to dig under this Confederate earthworks failed and many losses followed. General Grant now ordered his men to the southern shore of the James River near Petersburg. The 124th took up positions 200 yards from enemy lines, staying there in trenches. At Petersburg, the 124th was either posted for guard duty, or picket duty rather, and were assigned to dig trenches. At times, they were so close to Confederate lines that they could talk and trade with their counterparts. Before attempting to take the city of Petersburg, while Richmond lay in close proximity, General Grant planned to cut off all critical Confederate supply lines needed by Lee's army, very much similar to the plan that he had used at Vicksburg, starving the city and closing it off to prevent the army and the citizens from being able to resist. To that effect, at the end of November, the 124th was transferred to the left side of the line where General Warren had captured a Confederate junction at the Weldon Railroad. And in November of 1864, Grant targeted the Southern Railroad, so he's going after railroad supply lines that were needed. Members of the 124th were put to work clearing roads and building defenses. It was the main channel of communication between Petersburg and the country to its rear. The 124th, now with 16 officers and 230 enlisted men under the command of Regis de Trobriand, was ordered to take out a Confederate battery on its path, assisted by U.S. sharpshooters and other troops with repeating rifles, taking over the battery and sent the enemy in retreat. In December of 1864, the Union Army destroyed the Weldon Railroad, which had responsible for shipping supplies from North Carolina. During the assault, Southern guerrillas murdered Union soldiers and left their bodies naked for all to see. A sergeant's body was found under a floor. As an act of revenge, houses were burned down and a church was torched. While taking part in the burning of the railroad ties and the bending of iron rails, Charles Wyant, recently returned to active duty, denied any part of the 124th in the torching of houses in the church. After the Weldon raid, the 124th built their winter quarters. In January of 1865, Charles Wygant was appointed the last commander of the march of the 124th by Governor Reuben Fenton. Victories by General William Tecumseh Sherman in the Carolinas proved to be an isolating experience for General Lee. If he could not continue the fight or hook up with Confederate troops elsewhere, the Confederate cause would be lost. Lee took the offensive in assaulting Fort Stedman on the Union line just outside Petersburg. His hope was to link up with Joseph Johnston in North Carolina. Despite taking the fort, Lee could not break through the Union line, now loaded with men and artillery. The 6th and 2nd Corps eventually retook the fort, and the 124th took its place along the picket line, repulsing the 49th Alabama and capturing its battle flag as well as its commander. Grant moved in further on Lee's supply line. At the Battle of Five Forks, Union forces took control over several important roads needed by Lee. Once they were in Union hands, General Grant ordered the bombardment of Petersburg. During the siege at Petersburg, men of the 124th filled in to shore up the Union lines wherever needed, and frequent attacks by these regiments, like the 124th, prevented Lee from being able to solidify his lines. As the Union assault on Petersburg was halted by General Grant, Lee sent a telegram to Richmond telling the War Department to evacuate the city, which was 13 miles away. Few people in Richmond were aware of the events taking place just south of them in Petersburg, and the news to evacuate literally hit them like a ton of bricks. Davis and his cabinet left the city. Chaos reigned in the Confederate capital. Tobacco warehouses were burned down. Ironclad ships and bridges were blown up, and stores were pillaged. Lee also fled, leaving Confederate defenses at Petersburg while Grant pursued him. Lee moved his army out to Chesterfield, Virginia, some 8 miles away. Before leaving, he had telegrammed, this is a freak story, by the way. Before leaving, he also telegrammed the station in Danville to send needed supplies to Amelia Courthouse for his hurting army. The 3 long trains of Confederate essentials arrived in Danville only to be sent back at the request of a Confederate official in Richmond. He meant the empty cars, not the full cars. So Lee's supplies go away, and Lee's like, holy cow, his heart sank when he heard the news. On April 4th, the 1865, the 124th was sent out to forage for food and later joined Philip Sheridan's command at Jetersville near Danville, which was now in Union hands. Lee was now hoping he could escape west to Lynchburg. The last engagement of the 124th occurred at Sailor's Creek when it took control of Confederate wagon train of 15 to 20 wagons along with 2 brass guns. With the wagons secured, the 124th captured 6,000 Confederate prisoners, 400 more wagons, 30 more pieces of artillery, and 13 battle flags. Lee attempted to burn bridges to prevent the army from catching him and his men. When Sheridan and Sickles' Corps arrived at Appomattox Courthouse, the last remaining location for Lee to pick up supplies for his men depleted was seized. At noon on April 9, 1865, Generals Lee and Grant met to discuss the terms of surrender. While the 124th lined itself along the road to Appomattox, their former commander from Gettysburg, General George Meade, rode by with his staff. This is a great quote by Wygant, by the way. Our old commander's face for once wore a smile. Love it. The men tossed up their caps, blankets, and knapsacks in jubilation. The war's end brought relief to soldiers on both sides until news reached them of Lincoln's assassination on April 14th. The only relief left after that horrific event was that Seward had survived, Grant was alive, and Confederate troops continued to surrender. The 124th stayed in D.C. for the 2-day review of Union troops of the Army of the Potomac. Once they reached New York City at Hart's Island, they eventually transferred. The remaining 130 men took the train, the Mary Powell, to Cornwall and marched to Newburgh, where its destination was Washington's headquarters, the sacred site of the Continental Army. A crowd of 10,000 visitors lined the streets with firemen and leading citizens marching in front of the famed orange blossoms. In an address to the crowd, Judge James W. Taylor remarked, "We have demonstrated in this rebellion that the greatest power any nation can have is to govern and preserve itself." Amen. We are all blessed by the service and sacrifice of the 124th and the dedication of those from Monroe who chose to serve their nation and their state. Okay? So I just wanted to, then I think I'm just going to kind of move on a little bit and talk about some other things relative to the war itself, and I think you'll find some really interesting points here. On April 23, 1862, the New York State Legislature passed a militia law requiring all white male citizens between 18 and 45 to enlist. Its purpose was to fill the ranks of the state militia in the event that enough volunteers couldn't be raised for regiments as requested by President Lincoln. This was in place, in fact, till the draft. On August 4th, Lincoln called for an additional 300,000 men, as we've said, over the various states for a service of 9 months, of which New York's quota was 59,705. This call to service via state militias was common before the Union instituted the draft in 1863. The enlistment of eligible men led to a request for exemptions from service. The town of Monroe kept a book where those requests were kept, and Jim Nelson just gave this to me, I would say, about a month ago. In this volume, there were 52 requests found with statements recorded by either the town justice or the justice of the peace or the town clerk in August of 1862. While the names are too numerous to mention here, there's a snapshot of them that provides some interesting details. So I'm going to pull up a couple of these. First is James Ryder. Let's see what we get from James Ryder. As the town of Monroe, they start with the same language. I'm not going to read it all the way through all the time, but essentially in response to the Militia Act of 1862, they decide that they are going to, for the following reasons, on the ground of his exemption, that he is a Quaker, of Quaker birthright. So we all know that Quakers, or should know that Quakers were pacifists, so there were approximately 8 people of the 52 that said they couldn't serve because they were pacifists. Okay, let's go to Edward Smith. Here is Edward Smith, and his reason, he is a foreigner, right? An Irishman, right? And has never been a citizen of the United States. So there were 3 people of Irish descent, all Irish, that claimed that they couldn't serve because they were of foreign birth. There are 4 people that claimed issues like rheumatism. 5 people had foot problems. Here's an eye problem. David Hunt Jr. had an eye problem. This is really good. This blew me when I did. Here's what it said. What were you told, by the way, when you were a kid and there was an eclipse? Don't look at it. This guy looked at it. Here's the problem. Right, his disability at the sun, he's lost his eyesight because he took a look at the sun in the eclipse. And as a result, he was blind in one eye, and as a result, couldn't serve. Okay, and he was among 5 people that had eye problems. Next, there is an example, John R. Compton. Interesting, and this was not unusual either, because people did. It says, I have served in the uniform company, uniformed and equipped according to the law for about 10 years. So in other words, he's saying, I already served my time. He was among 3 others that said that they had previous service. And then there were a number of other things, finger and hand problems. 2 people were too old. Remember, it said up to 40, and they said after 40 you're excused, so they said they were over the age. And then you have James Campbell. And this is probably true of many people. Maybe not all that many, but this is James Cromwell's issue. I underline it myself, by the way. I didn't write on original documents. I underline on copies, just so you know. Okay? He cannot see distance much, caused by the fall from a horse. Says he is lame in his right foot, so much so that it's painful to walk or stand. So, being a farmer, being on a horse, anyway. Other problems, there were others that include such problems as asthma, piles, hernia, abscesses, blood pressure, consumption, which you know is tuberculosis, and liver disease. I don't know anything about the outcome of those people and what happened, whether they were excused or not. Don't know. All right, the solid contributions of Monroe's residents to the Civil War effort require special attention be paid to those who made a unique contribution to it. We are in many ways appreciative of Reverend Daniel Nyes Freeland for including many of them in his work, The Chronicles of Monroe in the Olden Time. Jim, do we still have copies of that for sale? We did. We still have that. Dr. John Forshee, the doctor who's buried in Seamanville, enlisted in the Army of the Potomac. As I said, he served as an assistant surgeon with boats the 66th and the 11th New York Zouaves. The Zouaves, by the way, if I didn't mention them, the Zouaves had the fancy uniforms that were of French design, organized by Elmer Ellsworth, Lincoln's law clerk in Washington, fancy-looking uniforms. He was with McClellan's men during the Peninsular Campaign in the Eastern Theater. Unfortunately, he was taken, like I said, with chronic dysentery and came home to die, passing away in November 1862. Sad story about the general. And there are a lot of these stories. My own great-grandfather, John Kelly, was in the 49th Massachusetts. They believed he may have been poisoned while on guard duty. He was never able to work again, and he was buried by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts in a small rural cemetery. There is a story now of somebody who lived in Monroe, but who's buried in Highland Mills. His name is Dr. John Francis Frank Gigneux, Gignous. He was a noted surgeon who served in the Army of the Potomac. At the Battle of Antietam in Maryland, September 1862, he witnessed and participated in his first experience in the realities of war. Dr. Janoo was only 21 years old at the time. He graduated from Columbia University in 1865 with a degree in medicine, and after the war he returned to farming but remained available for consultations on surgery. According to his great-granddaughter, Missy Lane Holtz, who was personally a friend of mine and of Mary's, Dr. Janoo lived on the family farm, which, by the way, would have been right across the street from this building. So the Holtz farm was located here, where you see those nice houses now. That area was at one point the Holtz family farm. Just want to mention that. Okay? Let's see. And he died in 1883. And here, and unfortunately, when you try to find people, the only thing I find relative. Sorry, thank you. There's John Francis Janoo in the cemetery of the Highlands and Highland Mills. It just has his birth date, the year, and his death date, the year. There's nothing about his service in the Army of the Potomac, and so I think it might be worthwhile to approach the Town of Woodbury Historical Society about putting up a special marker recognizing his service in the Civil War. Monroe's own Brooks brothers is a tremendous story, and it's sad in some ways and wonderful in others. John Howard Brooks and Thomas Benton Brooks were engineers. They both served in the same unit, the New York State Engineers Regiment 1. They were together with Sorrell's topographical engineers who served in Kentucky and Tennessee. Thomas graduated from Union College School of Engineering and enlisted in the Army after the First Battle of Bull Run. As a member of the 1st New York Regiment of Volunteers Company A, he participated in many critical battles and campaigns of the war, including Fort Pulaski in Georgia, Fort Wagner in Charleston, which was immortalized in the movie Glory, and the Siege of Charleston, South Carolina. He received the Sumter Medal for his service in the Fort Wagner and Charleston campaigns. General Peter Mikey of West Point, Mikey Stadium, where they play football, right, Al? We know that, right? Said that Thomas Brooks was an inspiration to the whole command while serving in South Carolina. What's really interesting, I'm going to get into the siege of Charleston in a little near the end. And I'm almost done, by the way. John Howard Brooks, the second lieutenant, while stationed at Petersburg in 1864, was shot and killed as he stood on the entrenchment. Mourning the loss of his son, Father John Brooks wrote a poem to honor him. A monument was erected. That's the first picture I showed you. That tall obelisk was erected in the Monroe Community Cemetery, recognizing him as well as and there was a dedication ceremony that was held to honor that monument. General Thomas Meagher spoke that day. Now, I love this quote. General cities have their architectural piles and mausoleums, but the true monuments of a rural community are her brave sons. Upon the death of his only brother, Colonel Thomas Brooks resigned his commission and went into private life. Benjamin Webb Thompson was the son of First Presbyterian minister John Thompson, who was at the church where we go, and some of my friends in here go, from 1836 to 1846. When the war broke out, he was living in Florida and then moved back north to Port Byron, New York, just north of Auburn. There he organized a full company and was chosen its captain. After serving at Harper's Ferry, he was reassigned to the Army of the Potomac in Gettysburg and was wounded at Seminary Ridge. After Gettysburg, he was promoted to major and took command of the 32nd U.S. Colored Troops at Hilton Head, South Carolina. There he was promoted again to Provost Marshal General. In his last wartime role, Thompson served as a flag of truce officer as a lieutenant colonel. He supervised prisoners in both armies, including high-ranked civil officials like Jefferson Davis. He sent an expedition to Andersonville, Georgia, after its Union prisoners were liberated, and provided critically needed resources to the most forlorn crowd that civilized warfare had ever witnessed. When the war ended, he moved to Williamsport, Pennsylvania. My wife and I managed to do a tour of Andersonville, Georgia. It is depressing. It's out in the middle of nowhere where they wanted it. These men, as the war goes on, didn't have the resources that they should have had as prisoners, and the conditions were just horrendous. All right, I want to talk about somebody who was not a Civil War veteran, but who plays a role in this Civil War saga that we're in. His name is Edward Dipple. He is an unlikely Civil War hero because he wasn't a soldier in any state regiment. Dipple was a New York City police officer from Monroe at the time of his death. I'm going to pull up his cemetery stone here. And it's really cool because it's really unlike. He died on July 19th, 1863. He was only 20 years old. In July of 1863, the U.S. government had enacted the first military draft in American history. With the nation's existence at stake, President Lincoln, with Congress's support, called for the registration of all able-bodied men between the ages of 20 and 45. A man could hire a substitute for $300, causing deep resentment among many impoverished people, especially those living in major cities, which also contained a large number of immigrants. In July of 1863, draft riots broke out in New York City and lasted for 4 days, often targeting African Americans, neighborhoods, and those sympathetic to their cause, such as abolitionists. During those riots, an African American orphanage and a black church were torched. Several were even lynched by unruly mobs. At the time, Edward Dipple had been with the police force for 2 years and was assigned to its Broadway squad. On July 14, 1863, by the way, which happens to be the same time that black men are distinguishing themselves at Fort Wagner in South Carolina, Officer Dipple was attempting to prevent the looting of a home of a known abolitionist when he was shot and killed, being one of 4 police officers to die during the draft riots, leaving behind his wife and daughter. For years, Officer Dipple's dedication to service went unrecognized, but years later, July 19, 2003, 140 years after his death, he was given an inspector's funeral, followed by his name being inscribed on the Orange County Law Enforcement Memorial Wall. Thanks to friends like Thomas Carton Sr., former Supervisor Mike Frericks, and Monroe Historical Society's own Jim Nelson, Officer Dipple finally got the recognition that he so richly deserved. Yes, ma'am.
What was the reason for the draft riots?
Many of them, by the way, were poor people. They couldn't afford the draft. They paid an exemption of $300, so they thought it was a class thing.
Resisting the draft?
Yeah, correct.
And why were they attacking the black neighborhoods?
Because they felt that they were being enlisted to serve and liberate black people. So they got angry and caused a resentment for them. That's correct, yes. Unfortunately, they were not. I don't see justification there myself. Anyway, now I want to mention the dramatic end of what I have for you. Peter Parrott of Monroe was the brother of Robert Parrott of Cold Spring, just across the Hudson in Putnam County. Robert was a West Point graduate. After the War of 1812, the U.S. government had 3 foundries established, government-owned, to produce ordnance and improve the nation's defenses. A 4th foundry, a private enterprise, was created in Cold Spring and was known as the West Point Foundry, being located close to the U.S. Military Academy, but not too close, on the Hudson's western shore. In 1836, Robert, having served as the Point's ordnance inspector, became the foundry's superintendent. On the eve of the Civil War, Robert Parrott developed his own 10-pound cannon featuring a rifled barrel. For those who know what a rifled barrel is, it's a barrel with grooves that causes the bullet or the projectile to spin rather than just to be lobbed, so it maintains accuracy. That's the big difference here with this. Much more accurate than unrifled barrels like the Dahlgren gun. Eventually, he designed a variety of cannons bearing his name that were 20-pound, 30-pound, 60-pound, 100-pound, 200-pound, and even 300-pound shells. President Lincoln actually traveled to West Point with General Winfield Scott to witness the firing of his 2 largest guns. The unique feature of those deadly weapons, aside from the rifling technology, was an extra band of iron surrounding the breech for added safety. The iron needed in the production of the Parrott cannons often came from Monroe. Brother Peter Parrott supervised the shipment of iron from the Greenwood furnace, which the family owned, going from here to the West Point Foundry and then to Cold Spring. The name of the Greenwood Forest was later changed to Arden and is now located in the hamlet of the same name that you see coming up the thruway. The Parrott cannon, or Parrott rifle as some called it, made a profound difference in the outcome of the Civil War. At Fort Pulaski in Georgia and Savannah, which my wife and I spend our winters, we've been to Fort Pulaski numerous times, located at the mouth of the Savannah River. The new cannons were fired from batteries on Tybee Island 3 miles away, and after a 30-hour bombardment, the Confederate commander, Confederate General Olmsted of the fort, surrendered. The accuracy of the shells convinced him that an explosion of the fort's powder magazine would kill all of those inside the fort. If one visits the fort today, you can still see shell fragments lodged in the outer walls. By the end of the war, the West Point Foundry had produced over 2,700 Parrott cannons and 1.3 million shells of various calibers. Once manufactured, Parrott cannons were sent to key points along the Confederate coast and on naval ships in the Union Navy. According to the book West Point Foundry, which I happen to have a copy here, which was written several years ago by Trudy Grace and Mark Forlow, noted no other manufacturer of artillery matched his improvement and production levels during the Civil War. I want to just pull some of the cannons up to show you what they look like so that you probably picture Civil War cannons. Length. By the way, on swivels, those wheels move, and this swivels, this wooden platform it's on swivels, so you can move and direct it. And then, of course, good luck moving this. The cannon. There were some issues with it. Sometimes the friction coming out of the rifle barrel became a problem, but by and large, relatively effective weapons. As a reminder of the service of the legal men of Monroe, town residents organized a stock company in 1861 in order to purchase a cannon which could be used on public occasions requiring or inspiring its use. In order to purchase the cannon, $100 had to be raised. A list of donors or shareholders was created, and the purchase was made. The cannon in question resembled a Parrott cannon featuring the extra band at the breech, but no one could validate its authenticity as a Parrott rifle. Since its last placement on the village green at Museum Village, Roscoe Smith's 19th century heritage facility, it's believed the cannon was found which had found its final resting place. It may have been a Delafield cannon that was manufactured in 1861-62. No one really knows for sure. As cannons developed, sometimes inventors, used other people's ideas, and so we're not really sure. But I'll show you what a picture of that cannon looks like. And having been to Museum Village, I'm trying to remember, it was last day. Don't know. Anyway, to make a long story short, the road traveled to discover Monroe's role in the American Civil War was a long but interesting one. By the way, in case you don't know, it took Ken Burns 4 years to do his program on the Civil War on PBS. It took 4 years to fight the war. Didn't take me that long. When research begins, the historian often does not know what he or she will find. This presentation is not the end-all, but hopefully a good beginning of that process. Among the most meaningful commentary found along the way was a comment made by Colonel Thomas Benton Brooks. I had the good fortune to be born in Monroe, New York. After writing this chapter in Monroe's deep history, I can appreciate how he felt. Thank you very much. Will do, okay? Questions? I got it. Okay, hold on. It's on. Test? Okay. If anybody has questions, Jim will take the microphone around and I'll do my best. I will mention that, by the way, mention that Jim has just had protected the original copy of those who donated to purchase the cannon in September of 1861. And so, in honor of this event, it's a good thing to have you come and take a look at that.
Hey, Paul.
Yes, Dave.
Good job.
Thank you very much.
You sing well in the choir, too. You're going to be there tomorrow?
Is there a question in your future, Dave, or what? No, thank you. I will be, yes.
Listen,
Only kidding.
I take it that the guys who couldn't see they had eye problems. I imagine they couldn't vote.
No.
Because when you have a vote in a group like this, the ayes have it.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you. By the way, not everybody signing those statements could sign their name. There were X's on about 5 of those statements, those documents. Anything else? Richie.
Yeah, hey Paul, just a general question. How far north did the war actually get? Was it Gettysburg or?
In terms of major campaigns?
Yeah.
In the north, Gettysburg. In the south, you go down to Florida. If you want to really go further north, there was an attempted raid in St. Albans, Vermont, by the Confederates. John Wilkes Booth was noted, by the way, for going to Canada to talk with Confederate agents. There were blockade runners going off the coast. At the beginning of the war, Winfield Scott had created a blockade, and so blockade runners in the movie Rhett Butler in Gone with the Wind is running blockades back and forth trying to get goods into the South. And Bermuda was often a location because they were British. They were often friendly to Confederates because of the cotton trade. Interesting story, when Mary and I were on a cruise in Bermuda, we got a question. This guy was going to give a presentation, and called it the war between the states. And I said, wasn't it the war of the rebellion? And it's just interesting. That was his perspective. By the way, New York State, there's a wonderful 5-volume history which the Historical Society has. It's called New York and the War of the Rebellion, and it's really a full volume series explaining all these different things. But New York had 298 regiments. So it's difficult. It's daunting. I mean, Wygant, when he got back to Newburgh, was dedicated to writing this down, and he went through everything. It took him like 10 years to finally get it done. But he wanted to get it done because it was important. He wanted that record. Yeah, okay.
When is your book coming out?
We live in Cromwell Heights,
Right.
We're pretty high up, and I think we can hear cannons from West Point during celebrations, or is that an auditory?
No, that happens whenever they do their summer concert series. Cannons go off. They do the West Point, or the 1812 Overture, and they fired cannons. Now, the interesting thing about West Point is when they tested the pair of cannons, remember, Cold Spring is located on the opposite side of the Hudson. They had to fire over to West Point. Oh. You don't want to go walking around West Point in areas you're not familiar with. You just don't. It's a safety issue. Yes?
I also heard about the human cannonball.
Don't know anything about that. Yeah.
He was fired.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Okay, yes?
You want to answer?
Yeah, I really didn't come across it. The only thing I came across, this isn't necessarily a good thing, but the last Civil War veteran living in Monroe was George S. Hall. And George is buried in the Monroe Community Cemetery, and there are a couple of times where he's the last survivor of Civil War veterans. And the Monroe Gazette in 1925 said that he started off by firing the cannon to celebrate Memorial Day, and then he was given a gift, and the paper said purported to be from some of his friends in the Klan. I don't know if you know this, but the Klan was very active in cities in the North and the South in the 1920s as they expanded their hatred away from African Americans to include others like, Italians and Catholics and other groups, and Jews, for example. So there was some hostility there, but I have not been able to find any reference to what you're talking about. There was a small black population that lived in Monroe down behind, the old village. I don't know how to say it. Jim knows the address. It's just down behind the memorial, the memorial of the building that's not doing very well. By the railroad tracks, there was a small section of Monroe. African Americans lived in that community for a while. I don't know how long, I don't know from when to when, but there was some. But not that many, as far as I know. Yeah.
Question about the cannons and the 300-pounders.
Right.
Some of them look like naval cannons. Were any of those used on the ships
Yes.
to stop the blockade?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Parrott cannons were used not just on battle lines for field artillery. They were also placed in Union forts once they gained control of the Confederate coast and fired on Confederate forts. And then the small, in between, I would say maybe the 100 to 200 pounders were placed on Union ships. That's correct. Barry? That I didn't find. I didn't find any reference to that at this point, Barry. That's a very good question. I don't know. There were certainly enough people. I think what amazes me, when you think that Monroe had 0.3% of the state population, and that population includes 2 Civil War surgeons, a brigadier general, and soldiers that participated in perhaps about 18 different regiments, and in many cases, most of them serving in the 124th, which made a name for itself in most major campaigns of the Army of the Potomac. That has to be, that's something that every Monroe resident should be tremendously proud of.
I think we would probably find those names. Can we give them the mic? Also.
Yeah, B. Okay, hold on. Yep. Okay, I'll get the question. Hold on. The question was there a Grand Army of the Republic camp in Monroe? And I don't know the answer. I didn't find anything there. Go ahead.
You mentioned a few books that the Historical Society has. How would we get those? How do you order them?
Well, Jim can tell you. I didn't bring it, but Monroe in Olden Time, which is written by Daniel Nyes Freeland, is a pretty good book about the period in Monroe from like the 1840s on through like the turn of the century. So that gives you an idea. I don't know if you can probably look online, I'm guessing. I don't know. This was a special sale. I'll let you look at these if you want to write down the publication information. You may be able to find them online. I think probably the most accessible 2 books is this book, The 124th New York State Volunteers by Chuck LaRocca. It was published by McFarland Press, in Images of America, the West Point Foundry.
Can you slow down a little?
No problem. I'm going to leave them here.
Okay.
You can come up and get them. That way you won't have to write as I talk. So I'll leave. You're welcome to come and look at these if you want and get the information you're looking for. These last 2 are fairly recent. Okay? Oh, and I have one more. Actually, I have something else I want to offer you. Okay? This is for a free copy of this 1-volume PBS book, The Civil War, based on the series done by Ken Burns. Okay? All right, here's what I need an answer to. Give me the name of the Union officer whose street in Monroe bears his name. What's the name of the... He's not a general. Oh, sorry, I should have said general. I'm going to say general. I wasn't thinking of Forshee. I'm sorry?
Hobart Ward.
Hobart Ward. Thank you, Iris. Here you go. Hobart Ward Drive. Near the golf course? Perpendicular to the golf course. Any other questions? Greta. Greta, need the microphone. Hold on. Jim doesn't walk that fast. Hold on.
Thank you. Whenever we hear talk about the Civil War, we hear always about the role of the men. What about the women who actually were there and supporting the church. I mean, I can't imagine a bunch of men being able to survive without women to help
course
them.
not.
You know, so, you know.
Amen.
Right, yeah. So where is there any kind of indication that women were involved, particularly in the medics or the?
Right. We know, by the way, that there was a U.S. Sanitary Commission. There was a civilian agency created by the government to help provide support in creating and collecting medical supplies. We know that in Monroe, as I mentioned, men and women worked together to collect food and various things to send and package and go down and send to their sons and daughters in the field, collecting flannel and linen and clothing. If they're fighting year-round in wool suits, it gets very hot. You need comfortable cotton clothing to sleep in. And, you know, you also needed to keep the wool off your skin because wool is pretty nasty. But you needed wool because it kept you warm. Dave.
We have a friend who lives in Richmond.
Microphone? Hold on. Yeah, if you need to, raise your hand, have a microphone. Sorry.
We have a friend of ours who was a member of the church down in South Jersey, and we visited him in Richmond, of course, was the southern capital, right?
Yes.
And he took us to a hospital that was established during the Civil War, and they treated all kinds of Confederate soldiers, and I'm sure there were nurses working there.
Right.
And I
course.
imagine a lot of nurses helped the Union Army too. I don't know if there were hospitals that they were treated in. Not really?
And there were hospitals where soldiers were treated, usually back, you know, away from the front lines.
Okay.
There was a reference to Clara Barton that I read in one of the comments. I'm not sure whether it was Dr. Forshee or Dr. Genoux. I think it was Dr. Forshee. It may have been Antietam. That Clara Barton was present at Antietam. Of course, women served as nurses in the Civil War. Women served as spies during the Civil War. Harriet Tubman recruited black men in South Carolina. She traveled back and forth to the north in order to enlist volunteers. What amazed me a little bit, and I love the movie Glory, I saw it like 5 times when it came out, is that Harriet Tubman was recruiting men to serve in the Union Army. I was surprised they didn't say anything, but I think it was more, the movie was focused on the role of the men, but I thought it should have been something that should have been at least briefly mentioned. But no, they don't ask me so. Anybody else? Any other questions? Okay. Yeah. Anybody? Chris, you got one or no? Somebody back there? Uh-oh. It's waiting for Jim.
Okay, so I've been to Museum Village a bunch of times, and I don't remember seeing that cannon shown where you're seeing it. So where do they keep the cannon?
I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know. I was thinking about that too. Holly and Iris and I were talking earlier. I was trying to remember if it's located there. You can see it in this picture here. It's enclosed by a fence. I don't believe there's that fence enclosure anymore. But there is down that green. That's where it was, near where, when we have our car, where we park. It has to be done? Okay. So at the moment, I don't know.
Don't forget this one.
Right. Okay, so please, all right, any more questions? Okay, I'm going to stay up here if you want to look at those books. By the way, please come and take a look at the original list of people that paid for that cannon in Monroe. I want to thank you. I hope you had a wonderful time and learn more and protect our cemeteries.